Is Hamas engaged in a war of disinformation as well as firepower? Joining me to discuss this is founder and CEO of the Israel Innovation Fund, Adam Bellos. Adam, it is fantastic to have you here. I have to ask, is the surveillance footage released by the IDF proof that Hamas is engaged in a global disinformation campaign about the conflict?
Thank you for having me, first and foremost. I would definitely say that Hamas has been engaged in a disinformation campaign for at least since 2007. If you look at every single conflict that has happened between Israel and Hamas, vis-a-vis over the Gaza Strip, there's always been some type of disinformation campaign. This is the first time where they've been caught not only inflating numbers, but suggesting that Israel had done something that they did not. It's part of their agenda. One of the things that's happening, and I'm sure you've seen this in many different interviews around the world, is that the Palestinian propaganda machine is going to fail, not only because of the butchery on October 7th, but also because they're scrambling. And this is the first time in very many years where the international media is actually siding with Israel over any type of Palestinian extremist group, if you've noticed.
Yeah, it's fairly extraordinary, all of the coverage. And look, Hamas clearly doesn't care about Palestinians. I mean, they put their headquarters and rocket launchers in hospitals and next to civilian buildings. Do you think that Hamas actually wants high numbers of Palestinian casualties so they can use them as propaganda against Israel?
As terrible as this sounds, I would say yes. If you look at the past conflicts in Gaza, they have always used babies and women as human shields. They've always worked to rack up the number of civilians that are lost on their side in order to make Israel look bad. This is something that has been a tactic of nearly every single radical Islamic group since the start of radical Islam expressing itself in violence. As you can see from the butchery on October 7th. And I mean, if you look at the way that ISIS behaved, if you look at the way the Taliban in Afghanistan behaved, using human shields is an easy way to make the enemy look bad if the international community doesn't understand the context of what's going on. And I think what is unfolding right now internationally is that the world is starting to understand the context in which we were arguing why Hamas was bad, if that makes sense. And with this situation with the hospital, it's only allowed people to really understand what we've been trying to explain to people about these radical Islamists for many years, and that is that they do not appreciate human life or sanctify human life the way the Israeli army and the Jewish people and the state of Israel always has and has always tried to conduct themselves, if that makes any sense.
I mean, that makes total sense, actually. The ideology behind it all is so brutal, and it's what I spoke about actually last week with Israeli politician Sharon Haskell about how this is not just a turf war. The radical Islamist ideology of Hamas would see Israel and the Jewish people exterminated. So do you think it's that holy war mentality that drives Hamas to justify sacrificing innocent Palestinians as well as Israelis?
So one of the things that I've actually been talking about on a lot of the segments I've been doing is that this looks like the final attempt of radical Islamists to try to start this holy war. And one of the things that's very important about understanding eschatological apocalyptic imagination, so to speak, or like a group of people who are set about bringing the apocalypse and the way that they interpret it, is that there is no reason not to sacrifice anybody in order for this religious eschatological goal, if that makes sense, or apocalyptic goal. So I do believe the ideology of the radical Islam that is perpetuating and fueling the Hamas group, and also if you read the Hamas charter, is very easy to understand because it's laid out in plain words. I do agree with her that this is much more than just a turf war. I would say that given that the majority of the fronts that we're fighting are proxies of Iran, that this is that ideological war that nearly had been destroyed because of ISIS and because of the birth of the Abraham Accords, which was becoming somewhat of a new type of NATO for the Middle East. So you will see, if this war does continue to spin out of control, the moderate Arab states will join Israel and the Western countries in some type of coalition. So to answer your question in short, yes, it is much more than a turf war. I would agree with Sharen's assessment there.
Yes, it's really terrifying. And what I've noticed, actually, there is a massive double standard between how the Western left talks about Israel and also how they talk about Ukraine. I remember when Russia attacked Ukraine, the left was just screaming for Ukraine to retaliate and admonishing anyone who said they shouldn't as somehow, anti-democracy. But when Hamas attacks Israel, we've heard calls for a ceasefire, we've heard calls for de-escalation. What is so different about Israel that it's not allowed to defend itself?
The difference is that it's a Jewish state, and the majority of the left is completely against the sovereignty or the independence or the self-determination of the Jewish people around the world. They reject our peoplehood. Thus, they reject the legitimacy of us having an army and us defending ourselves. You'll notice that this is the only country that is never allowed to actually win a war or finish a war. Since 1948, other than the peace with Egypt and the peace with Jordan, I believe the peace with Egypt was in 81 or 82. The peace with Jordan was in 1993, signed simultaneously with the Oslo Accords. We've never been able to have a diplomatic resolution to any of our military conflict in the last 75 years, other than the new peace treaties. So you can't expect us not to get into more conflict if there's no diplomatic resolution after some type of military exchange or some type of combat exchange. I do think that a very large core of the constant international clamoring for a ceasefire, and I noticed it as well, like they were constantly calling the Israeli response to October 7th like out of proportion. And then the news of the hospital came out, where everybody took Hamas's word for what happened without even fact checking anything on the ground. It was actually Al Jazeera that broke one of the videos that showed that Hamas was responsible, or Palestinian Islamic Jihad was responsible for the destruction of this area and the loss of what they're saying is 500 people. So I think it comes down to a systemic anti-Semitism, believe it or not, that is global, that has existed for 2,500 years in various forms, who disagree with the right of the Jewish people to defend themselves.
It has actually been really galling watching the commentary on this. This is going to sound very naive, but I just didn't realize there were that many people who didn't like Jewish people. Is that a response you've had from a lot of people, a surprise?
Well, one of the things that you were speaking about on the episode that Sharen joined you on was that there were, I think you were talking about in your monologue, was the protests that are around the world, and specifically that was outside of the Opera House in Sydney.
Yes.
And right, and to be honest, as somebody who was witnessing that from abroad, and then seeing what was going on in the major capitals around the world, I was not surprised. The second Lebanon war, the boycott, divestment, sanction movement has exploded on college campuses, mostly attracting descendants of the Middle East who are Muslim or Palestinian, or people who are immigrants to America or on visas or whatever, and the radical, like, revolutionary socialist left. And I have been trying to explain to people for years how important it is to fight this faction and this ideological nonsense, so to speak, which is really just fueled by modern Nazi propaganda or reworded Nazi propaganda about what Israel is and who the Jewish people are.
Absolutely.
To me, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised by any of this at all. It's very obvious that this has been an issue that has been percolating around the world. If you look at what happened in 2021 in the conflict between Gaza and Israel, there were people driving through the streets of London
Oh my
screaming,
God.
rape their daughters.
Oh, that is
So
absolutely
I'm
appalling, Adam. I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. We'll have to, please, we'll have to get you back on the show because this has been so enlightening. It is tragic, the anti-Semitism. It's tragic what's going on there. God bless you. We'll all be praying for you, and I do hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I loved having been introduced to your program. So thank you so much for everything that you're doing.